Good day. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 2, the contest for North America. This is one of the first of the revised chapters in this new 17th edition. We will begin with France. Much like England, which we will talk about in a minute, France was finally able to join in the scramble for colonies in the New World as a result of the end of the religious wars that engulfed France from 1562 to 1598. There will be constant bloodshed and violence between Catholics and Huguenots, who were French Calvinists, and ultimately the bloodshed will reach a peak in what's called the St. Bartholomew Days Massacre in 1572. Finally, Henry of Navarre, who was a Protestant, will now become the King of England once he converts to Catholicism, and he will issue the Edict of Nantes, which basically is a truce between Catholics and Protestants inside France, and will give Huguenots rights and privileges in certain areas where they were the majority. So now France will join the rush to explore North America. The father of France, New France, will be Samuel de Champlain. Champlain will come down the St. Lawrence River Valley, and his diplomacy with Native American groups contrasted to the domineering practices of the Spanish because he had witnessed them firsthand as a spy for 2 years. As a result, he will respectively negotiate alliance with many of the Indian tribes in the St. Lawrence River Valley. And he will make a pivotal and important decision when he will go on a expedition with the Hurons against their arch enemies, the Iroquois, and during that incident, 2 volleys from the French lightning sticks will rout the terrified Iroquois, who left behind 3 dead and 1 wounded. And for many years, the Iroquois will be hated enemies of the French. So during the early settlement of Quebec, the actions of Samuel de Champlain included forging a pivotal alliance with the Hurons that inspired the lasting hatred of the Iroquois. The government in New France or Canada was almost completely autocratic. Unlike the English colonies in America, in New France there were no popularly elected assemblies. The population of Catholic New France grew very slowly because of 3 reasons. 1, the French peasants had little economic reason to move to North America. The Protestant Huguenots, who would willingly come, were not allowed to move there, and the French government was much more concerned with its Caribbean island colonies that produced huge profits from sugar cultivation. But one valuable resource in New France was beavers, and the primary economic pursuit of the early settlers in New France was fur trapping. And the French Empire in North America rested on an economic foundation of fur trade with Indians. But it wasn't all good for the Native Americans because of this association with the French due to a fur trade. The Indians suffered from their association with the French in New France due to the decimation of their numbers by the white man's diseases, weakening of their traditional way of life, because 1, they had never killed animals in large numbers, but now because they desired French manufactured goods, guns, and other trade items, they will violate their own religious beliefs and engage in an endless slaughter of animals to acquire furs and pelts. And they finally will be debauched by the white man's alcohol. Much like the Spanish, the Jesuit priests will come to North America along with the early French explorers, and despite their initial failure in gaining converts, because they were very tolerant and recognize the worth of Native American traditions and religious beliefs, they will play a vital role because of their exploration and work as geographers. And as a result, several Jesuit priests will travel and discover the Great Lakes, and then eventually they will travel down the Mississippi River and reach its mouth in what will become known as Louisiana. So the expansion of New France occurred especially along the paths of North America's interior lakes and rivers, while on the other hand, England's expansion will be along the east coast of North America. The French wanted to control Louisiana because they would then control the mouth of the Mississippi, where they will eventually establish New Orleans. French motives in the New World included the desire to compete with Spain for an empire in America, much like the English will as well. Spain in North America. Spain, for almost a century after Columbus's arrival at Hispaniola, will enjoy an almost total dominance over the New World with no competition from any Western European power. The Spanish crown grew wealthy and influential from extracting the gold, but mainly silver, pearls, and other natural resources of Mexico, Peru, and other colonies. In fact, the 16th century, the 1500s, will be known as the golden century of Spanish history. But the problem with this huge influx of silver brought by Spanish treasure fleets from the Caribbean and South America across the Atlantic to Spain is that this silver did not stay long in Spain because there was no manufacturing capability or capacity in that nation, so they had to send their silver to other foreign countries to import luxury goods and manufactured goods that the Spanish elite wanted. But because of the first actions of exploration and colonization by the French and then the English, Spain will move into North America, even though they had found no gold in North America with the exploration of De Soto and Coronado during the 16th century. But in 1565, they will establish St. Augustine on the eastern coast of Florida, and it will be the first permanent European settlement in North America. Soon afterwards, after decades of exploration and negotiation with the Pueblo peoples of the region, they will establish the colony of New Mexico along the Rio Grande River. The Spanish saw New Mexico as a gateway into North America, California, and Texas in particular. They are particularly interested in establishing a colony in Texas because of the French encroachment and exploration and expansion along the Mississippi River Valley. And in 1610, they will establish the first capital in North America, the first permanent capital in North America, that will be Santa Fe. And unlike the established colonies of the Caribbean and Central America, Florida and New Mexico were principally centers of missionary rather than economic activity, and population growth will be very slow. Now England will join the fray. What had delayed England in the early parts of the 1500s in overseas exploration and colonization was just like what had happened in France, religious conflict. English society was disrupted by religious conflict when King Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church in 1530 after the Pope denied Henry VIII an annulment of his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was a staunch Catholic and the sister of Philip II of Spain. So as a result, the penetration of Protestantism into England will result in years of a seesaw battle between Catholics and Protestants for the balance of power. And England will take little interest in establishing its own overseas colonies in the first half of the 16th century. But after Henry VIII dies, he only leaves two daughters, no sons to succeed him. The first will be Mary Tudor, or better known as Mary Bloody Mary, who will wed Philip II of Spain because they are both staunch Catholics and they want to establish a Catholic dynasty by having a Catholic heir. But this does not happen, and Mary will die from probably ovarian cancer, and Philip will go back to Spain. This leaves Anne Boleyn's daughter Elizabeth, who is more Protestant than anything else, but she's a politic before anything else, and she believes that government and economic stability was more important than religious beliefs. So she will come up with a settlement in which the Church of England will blend Catholic ritual with Protestant doctrine. So after decades of religious turmoil, Protestantism finally gained permanent dominance in England after the succession to the throne of Elizabeth I in 1558. And now, when Elizabeth ascends to the throne, the rivalry with Spain will intensify because now it's Protestant versus Catholic. The first conflict will be in Ireland, to the west of the British Isles. This is because Ireland was staunchly Catholic, and even though the Irish believed that they could get aid and have an alliance with Spain, Spain never really came through with anything. And in the 1570s and 1580s, Elizabeth will basically send English soldiers to basically conquer and settle the northeastern part of the island of Ireland. This is Northern Ireland today. And because they viewed the Irish as savages, as natives, because of their Catholic faith, they will treat them contemptuously, and they will use violence and be unjust in their actions with the Irish, which they will bring with them across the Atlantic to North America. And this will be the basis for their view of Native Americans as savages, and English settlers' desire to remain separate from Native American peoples. They will not be like the early Spanish men who will intermarry and have families with Native American women. But the earliest English colonization efforts were total failures. England's first two North American colonies, which completely failed, were launched in Newfoundland and North Carolina, or Roanoke Island, by cousins. In Newfoundland, it will be Humphrey Gilbert, and in Roanoke, off the coast of North Carolina, it will be Sir Walter Raleigh. And when the rivalry intensifies and becomes war, the Roanoke Island will basically be cut off from England for several years, and when John White, who was one of the founders of Roanoke, comes back after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, he will find no settlers at Roanoke Island, and his granddaughter, the first white settler born in North America, has disappeared as well. The decisive event is Philip II's decision to send a 300-ship fleet north to basically end Protestantism not only in England but in the Netherlands, which was under Spanish rule. And even though the English ships are much more maneuverable, they still cannot break the crescent formation of the larger Spanish ships until a Protestant wind, a storm in the English Channel, will break it up and destroy many ships of the Spanish Armada. England's victory over the Spanish Armada gave it naval domination in the North Atlantic and gave rise to a vibrant sense of national identity, which Elizabeth supported. Also, England's victory over the Spanish Armada started its way on to becoming the master of the world's oceans till the 20th century. Now, under Elizabeth, because of religious settlement and compromise, England had a strong, unified national state under a popular monarch. And with the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the works of William Shakespeare, England will now develop a strong, vibrant sense of nationalism and national destiny. But after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Spain's dream of empire will begin to fade, and by the end of the 17th century, Spain is a second-rate power. But what was happening at the first attempts of settlement and colonization in North America by England? Well, it was undergoing rapid economic and social transformation because of the enclosure movement by landlords and landowners throughout England that forced small farmers off the land, which they had farmed for centuries as tenant farmers, and it will displace not only thousands of farmers, but their families as well. So we have hundreds of thousands of English country folk roaming the country, going to large cities like London and Bristol looking for work. Also, another group that is interested in colonization were unemployed yeomen and the younger sons of the gentry. The younger sons of the gentry had no hope because of the law of primogeniture that basically said that all of their father's fortune and wealth went to the oldest son. And the vast majority of the first hundreds of English settlers who go to Jamestown will be the younger sons of gentry. But England does not have the wealth that Spain has, so they will have to come up with the pre-modern forerunner of the corporation, the joint stock company, in which many investors will basically put a share of their wealth into a fund that will create a joint stock company, and the first one formed will be the Virginia Company. And the original purpose or primary purpose of the joint stock Virginia Company was to make a profit for its investors. The whole point to a joint stock company is that if one person or a few number of people financed an expedition and it was a failure, they were each financially ruined. But now with loss and failure, you only lost a part of your wealth. But why were the English ready for colonization in the early 1600s? Well, it was because of widespread unemployment, a thirst for adventure, a desire for markets, and because of a desire for religious freedom by separatists and Puritans who were English Calvinists. But one of the great legacies of the Virginia Company's charter is that it guaranteed that English settlers who left England for the New World would still retain their rights of Englishmen just as if they had remained in England. So they will basically land on the east coast of North America and choose a site called Jamestown. It was a very strategically protected site, but it was the worst site possible because of the topography. Swamps and marshes that bred mosquitoes and disease. And in the early years at Jamestown, the settlers faced starvation, disease, and frequent Indian raids. But at the beginning, the Powhatans, led by Chief Powhatan or Wahunsonucook, they were very conciliatory and friendly with the English settlers because Chief Powhatan saw them as a way for him to expand his influence and power over the surrounding Native American groups or tribes. But what happened is that even with even with an abundance of fish and game, early Jamestown settlers continued to starve because they wasted time looking for gold. These are the younger sons of gentry who had never done manual labor, and they refused to engage in agriculture. This will change when John Smith will take command, and he will force people to work or not eat if they didn't work. And by 1609, 1610, the winner of that 2 years, only 60 will survive the starving time. Only 60 out of the original 400 settlers who had come in 1607. And those 60 who survived the winter of 1609, 1610 will basically take a ship to the Chesapeake Bay intending to go back to England, but they will be met by a relief force led by Lord Delaware, who will basically take them back to Jamestown. And he will impose a harsh military regime, and he will use brutal Irish tactics in Virginia. And this will lead to 2 Anglo-Powhatan wars that will virtually exterminate Virginia's Native American population, that the majority were Powhatans. The first peace settlement in 1614 was arranged by the marriage of Pocahontas and the colonist John Rolfe. John Rolfe is as important to Jamestown's survival as John Smith, who instilled discipline and forced people to work in agriculture, is that he will develop a hybrid form of native growing tobacco that will become very profitable and become the staple export crop of the Virginia colony. They will marry, and in 1617 they will travel to England with their son, but Pocahontas will fall ill and die there, and this will have Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, abdicate his throne in favor of his brother. But by 1625, Virginia only had some 1,200 hard-bitten survivors of the nearly 8,000 who reached Jamestown to start a new life. The reason disease, widespread disease. The Second Anglo-Powhatan War will begin because of growing English expansion and encroachment on Native American lands. So the Powhatans will launch an offensive and tax. And it will eventually end after 1644. And it will end all chance of assimilating the native peoples into Virginia society. These 2 wars, the early conflicts between English settlers and the Indians near Jamestown, laid the basis for the forced separation of the Indians into separate territories of what we will come to know as the reservation system. So the reservation system that was not born in the Trans-Mississippi West, it was born on the east coast of North America with the first English settlement at Jamestown. So how could the Powhatans, who had some sense of unity and organization, why could they not defeat the English settlers? Well, your book gives you four ways or 4 reasons. 1, the native peoples of Virginia, the Powhatan, succumbed to the Europeans because they died in large numbers from European diseases. One reality that you have to remember in studying early colonial history, and even as American settlers moved west, that any time Native Americans came into contact with Europeans, they will die by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of European diseases because they had been cut off from the rest of the world and they lacked any kind of immunity or resistance to European diseases, especially smallpox, measles, and influenza. 2, they lacked the unity necessary to resist the well-organized whites. Once the Virginians began to grow their own money, they were no longer a resource for food. And 4, they were not a reliable labor source and could be disposed of without harming the colonial economy. And by 1685, the English settlers of Virginia basically considered the Powhatans to be extinct. To the north, the Netherlands, who have replaced the Portuguese as the dominant power in Africa and in Asia, and especially in control of the spice trade and trade of luxury goods from the Far East, China, the East Indies, they will now turn their attention, not with a great deal of vigor, to North America. And the Dutch West Indies Company's search for quick profits meant that the New Netherland was run as an authoritarian fur trading venture. So the Dutch colony of New Netherland, later New York, was established for its quick profit from fur trading. And it will be harshly and undemocratically governed, but the reality is, because of vast estates of land given to Dutch aristocrats called patroons, who would not sell their land to poorer Dutch immigrants, but would only rent the land to them, New Netherlands' Dutch population grows very slowly. So by 1664, New Netherlands' population was 10,000, but half of them were immigrants from New England. Why did it not develop in a large-scale manner? Well, one, its development was not a priority to the Dutch because they're more focused in the Far East and also in the Caribbean in establishing sugar islands. Also, it took an aristocratic air because of huge feudal estates known as patroonships. But it had one great asset. It had the greatest port and greatest harbor on the east coast of North America, and it will become very cosmopolitan, and this is the Dutch city of New Amsterdam, which will later become New York City. Okay? So why Dutch immigrants did not come to New York was because of the monopolistic land policies of the aristocrats or the patroons who had vast acres of land but would not sell the land to poor Dutch immigrants, but would only allow them to be tenant farmers. And in the 1680s, Peter Stuyvesant will have to basically surrender without firing a shot when James, Duke of York, who is the brother of Charles II of England, England will take over New Netherland and New Amsterdam, and now they become New York and New York City. But the cultural contributions to the Dutch included Easter eggs, Santa Claus, sauerkraut, and skating. Your book has a great section in the last part of this chapter called The Indian's New World. The arrival of competing European powers in North America caused profound changes for the Native Americans who lived there. But due to the fact that Native Americans had had their own long history well before Columbus's arrival, they were no strangers to change, adaptation, and even catastrophe, as the rise and fall of the Anasazi and Mississippian civilizations demonstrate. But the shock of large-scale European colonization disrupted Native American life on a vast scale, inducing unprecedented demographic and cultural transformation. Some historians who basically study demographics, they believe that by the 17th century, 90% of the original Native American population has died due to European diseases. One other great legacy of European arrival is the arrival of domesticated animals. There were none in North America or the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. And horses, stolen, strayed, or purchased from Spanish invaders, will precipitate a substantial Indian migration onto the Great Plains in the 18th century. And the introduction of horses brought about significant change in the lives of the Lakotas, or the Sioux, who had been sedentary forest dwellers in Minnesota, but now became nomadic, mounted hunters who followed and killed the massive migrating herds of buffalo or bison on the Great Plains. So the biggest disruptor of Native American life was European disease. But disease took more than human life. It extinguished entire cultures and occasionally helped shape new ones. Because the elderly and the children were often the most susceptible to smallpox, disease epidemics often robbed native peoples of their elders who preserved the oral traditions that held their clans together. Devastated Indian bands then faced the unprecedented task of literally reinventing themselves without benefit of accumulated wisdom passed on by elders or kinship networks. Splintered an example of this is that splintered remnants of several different groups uprooted by the shock of Europeans' arrival will merge into what will become the Catawba Nation in the Piedmont. But it wasn't just horses and diseases that transformed the Native American culture and its peoples, but trade. Trade also transformed Indian life as traditional barter and exchange networks gave way to the temptations of European commerce and trade goods. Whiskey, diseases, and muskets were European imports that threatened Native Americans' existence and their stability. Firearms, for example, gave enormous advantages to those who could purchase them from Europeans. How do they purchase these firearms? Well, they have to go and kill thousands of animals who they had not hunted in this manner before, so that they could supply the skins and pelts that the European armed traders wanted in exchange for their muskets. And what happened as a result is Native Americans will begin to compete and become enemies and create alliances so that they will basically be able to have access to growing smaller hunting grounds. So rivalries and alliances escalated among native nations and peoples because of the lure and desire for European trade goods. And as a result, if you look in the Iroquois Making of America section, the Iroquois which would be western and northwestern New York today, it had been established as a confederacy many centuries before the arrival of Europeans to stop the violence and conflict among the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk. But what is unusual about this culture and society is that it is a matrilineal society. Men dominated in Iroquois society, but they owned their positions of prominence to their mothers' families. Because in Iroquois society, two families would live together in one long house. When a man married, he moved into the home of his wife and her family. All men's connections and positions of prominence came from the maternal line. And the five nations joined together to form the Iroquois Confederacy, but they will maintain their independence. And the Confederacy will celebrate together and share a common policy towards outsiders, but they essentially remained independent of one another. With the arrival of the gun-toting Europeans, Iroquois supremacy will be threatened, and it will enmesh the Confederacy in a tangled web of diplomatic intrigues, because throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, they allied alternately with the English against the French and vice versa. They worked this rivalry to their own advantage and could maintain their independence and sovereignty. But this will end with the beginning of the American Revolution, when the Confederacy could not reach a consensus on which side to support. Each tribe will be left to decide independently. Most, though not all, will side with the British, and with British defeat, the Iroquois Confederacy will be in shambles. So in the face of devastating diseases, war, and dislocation, Native American tribes adopted the strategy of merging with other tribes, which in the Iroquois section are called mourning wars. And the purpose of the periodic mourning wars was the large-scale adoption of captives and refugees, so to further and expand the Iroquois population.